The registry went down at 2:14. I know the exact time because I was awake when it happened. I am almost always awake at that hour, which is a fact about field medicine that nobody puts in the recruiting materials. I had been sitting at the intake desk in the main tent reviewing the morning supply manifest when the system simply stopped. No warning chime, no staged shutdown. The screen went gray. The timestamp in the upper right corner of the terminal froze, then corrupted, then displayed the same meaningless string over and over. 88, 88, 88, 88, 88, 88, the digits the system generates when it can no longer locate a valid time reference. 8 eights in a row repeating. I had seen that display before, on dead equipment, on servers that had taken impact damage, on terminals that had been running for so long without maintenance that the clock chip simply gave out. I had never seen it on a live operational registry in the middle of an active camp cycle. I pressed 3 keys in succession. Nothing. I rebooted the terminal from the hard switch on its side. The screen came back and showed the same frozen string. That was when I understood it was not the terminal, it was the server. I pushed back from the desk and walked to the relay cabinet at the rear of the tent. The status light that should have been green was amber. I opened the cabinet panel, looked at the diagnostic strip, and confirmed what the amber light meant. The central registry node for Cavel's Reach Transit Camp had lost synchronization with the colonial grid. Uplink, failed. Local cache, corrupted during the drop. The last clean snapshot was 61 hours old. 61 hours. In a camp processing 740 irregular arrivals through its medical intake, that meant 61 hours of new entries, patient files, medication logs, identity confirmations, vulnerability flags were gone from the live record. Not deleted, just inaccessible, locked in a crashed partition the system could not read. The backup relay would not spin up until the grid signal returned. And the grid signal would not return until the Colonial Transmission Tower at Heth Station completed its scheduled maintenance window, which was listed on the logistics sheet pinned to my cabinet as 44 hours from now. 44 hours of no registry. The evacuation convoy was scheduled to arrive in 51. I stood in front of that amber light for about 30 seconds. Then I went back to the desk, pulled out the paper intake ledger I had been told to stop using 3 postings ago, and opened it to the next blank page. If the machines would not keep the record, I would keep it myself. That is what 22 years teaches you. The record exists because someone decides it exists. The system is not the record. The system is just the machine someone built to hold the record until the machine fails. I had been a field medic for the Colonial Humanitarian Auxiliary since I was 26. I had done postings on 6 different border stations, 2 crash response deployments, and 1 quarantine support rotation that I still do not discuss in any formal setting. I had outlasted 3 station commanders, 2 complete equipment cycles, and 1 full reorganization of the auxiliary's command structure. I was 48 years old and I had learned to keep a paper ledger the way some people learn to keep a spare key. Not because you plan to need it, but because the day you do not have it is exactly the day the lock changes. I was halfway through the night's backlog, matching paper entries to the patient records I kept in my own encrypted personal terminal, which was not connected to the camp's server and therefore still functioned, when I heard the noise from the supply annex. The supply annex is a secondary tent attached to the main medical structure by a covered walkway. It holds the non-perishable inventory, bandaging, fluid packs, air filtration canisters, a rotating stock of sealed nutrition units, and whatever the quarterly resupply ship drops that has not yet been cataloged. The resupply ship had docked 4 days ago. I had signed for the delivery, done a surface count, and sent the packing manifests to the registry, which, as of tonight, could no longer confirm receipt of anything. The noise was small, a shifting sound, like a heavy bag settling against the inside of a container wall. Then something very faint, a breath, or the noise a breath makes when it is being carefully not made, when someone is controlling the exhale with the specific discipline of a person who has learned that the wrong sound at the wrong moment ends everything. I am not a suspicious person by temperament. I am a careful one, which is different. Suspicious people imagine threats. Careful people identify them. I picked up my handheld lamp, crossed the walkway, and pushed through the annex flap. The supply crates were stacked in the standard configuration. Large units on the floor, smaller inventory on the shelving along the left wall, fragile stock behind the rated partition at the far end. Everything looked correct by lamplight. I walked the aisle once, slowly, holding the lamp low, listening to the particular silence that follows a noise that stopped when the light came on. The sound had come from the third crate on the floor. A large cargo unit, olive drab polymer, sealed with a standard pressure latch. The manifest tag on its side read, Fluid Concentrate, Saline Type II, 48 units. Sealed from the resupply ship 4 days ago, inventoried by surface count, logged to a registry that no longer existed. I crouched and put my hand flat against the polymer side. It was warm. Saline concentrate is stored at ambient temperature. There is no mechanism in a sealed polymer crate that generates heat from within. I unlatched the seal and lifted the lid. She was curled in the lower third of the crate, wrapped in what appeared to be a cut-down emergency thermal sheet, the foil kind, silver on one side, which someone had folded around her like a second skin and then crimped at the edges to hold without tape, because tape makes noise when you move. She was small. Not newborn, not an infant old enough to be aware, old enough to be deliberately quiet, which she was. She had her knees drawn to her chest and her face pressed to the foil, and she was breathing in the exact, shallow, careful rhythm of a child who has been taught to make herself small enough that the air around her does not notice she is there. Her skin was bone white with a faint copper tracery at her temples and along her collarbone circuit-thin lines, the kind of vascular marking some Velhara subspecies carry, not a design, just biology, the way some humans are born with visible veins at the wrist. Her hair was black and very short. Her eyes, when she opened them because the lamplight had found her face and there was no point pretending anymore, were amber, not light amber. Deep amber, almost copper, almost the same color as the markings at her collarbone. She looked at me with the absolute stillness of a child who has already understood that being found is not the same as being safe, and that the next few seconds would tell her which this was. I set the lamp on the crate beside hers. I sat back on my heels. I did not move toward her. After a moment I said, quietly, in the transit camp most camps use as a working lingua franca, "I'm the medic." She said nothing. "You don't have to move," I said. "I'm going to check the canister." There was an air supply canister in the lower corner of the crate, partially visible behind her elbow. The pressure gauge on its face was in the red. Someone had rigged it carefully. It was feeding breathable atmosphere inside the sealed crate through a small bore tube crimped against the lid's inner seal, the tube held in place with what looked like medical adhesive tape from a standard field kit. Someone who knew what they were doing had prepared this. The canister was cracked along the bottom seam, not fully compromised, but losing pressure at a rate I did not like. She had been breathing recycled air in a sealed polymer box for 4 days. I reached past her carefully and wrapped my hand around the canister and twisted it free of its port. She flinched. Just the one movement, controlled immediately. I set the canister aside, opened the annex's main air valve at the wall. The tent's own filtered atmosphere flooded in, cool and clean and smelling of nothing particular, and watched her breathe it. The second breath she took was deeper than the first, involuntary. She tried to make it look like nothing. "Better air," I said. She did not answer, but I watched her chest settle in a way that had nothing to do with choice. I stayed where I was. I looked at her size, her condition, the precise, deliberate way she was holding herself together, and I did the calculation that field medicine teaches you to do in the first 30 seconds of any intake. What does this person need right now in order of urgency? Air. Addressed. Temperature. She was warm, had been too warm inside the sealed crate, but she was not hypothermic, and the annex air was already correcting. Hydration. Critical. 4 days in a sealed environment with no visible water source meant she was dehydrated beyond what she could show me, the body compensating hard. Fluid within the hour. Nutrition. Secondary to hydration, addressable. Injury assessment. I could see no acute injury, but I would need her still and cooperative for a full check, and that required her to trust me, which required time I would not rush. Psychological state. She was terrified and containing it with a discipline that a child should not have had to develop, which told me more about where she had been before the crate than any file could have. I did not ask her name. I did not ask who had put her in the crate. I did not ask anything that would require her to decide in the next 3 seconds whether I was safe. I said, "I'm going to get a fluid pack and some nutrition units from the shelf. I'll be right back. You don't have to move." She watched me go. I want to say something about that watching. She did not watch me the way a frightened child watches a stranger, which is a flinching, avoidant watching, a watching that hopes not to be noticed back. She watched me the way a careful person watches something they are trying to understand, something they have not yet decided the nature of. There was assessment in it, calculation even. She was 4 years old or somewhere near it, and she was calculating. I have worked with a great many people over 22 years. Children most of all, in the transit camp context, because children are the largest part of any unaccompanied irregular population. I have learned to read the difference between a child who is waiting to be afraid and a child who has already moved past fear into the harder country beyond it, the place where fear becomes precision, where every decision is about minimizing exposure and maximizing information. She was in that harder country. She had been there for a while. I was back in 4 minutes. I had also brought a clean thermal wrap from the medical supply shelf, because the emergency foil she was wearing was designed for short-term exposure, and she had been in it for 4 days, and it would be pulling moisture from her skin. I sat on the floor of the annex, not at the crate, just on the floor at a distance where she could see my hands, and I opened the nutrition unit and set it at the edge of the crate where she could reach it without moving toward me. Then I punctured the fluid pack, attached the line, and held the end out toward her. She looked at the line for a long time, the fluid drip at the end of it, the way I was holding it loose, not pushing, just present. Then she reached out one hand, slowly, her eyes on my face the whole time. She took the end of the line and put it in her mouth. She drank. She did it with the same controlled precision she did everything else, as if even drinking was something that had to be managed in a way that minimized exposure. Small measured pulls, not desperate. Whatever else had happened to her, she had not let desperation become her default state. That matters more than people realize. Desperation makes you predictable. She was not predictable. I sat on the floor of the annex and watched her drink and let the silence be a comfortable thing, and while it settled, I began to think. She was not in the camp registry. She was not in the camp registry because the camp registry did not exist in any recoverable form, which meant she was not anywhere in any system I could access or that could access me. The resupply ship's manifest listed her crate as saline concentrate, and the ship was 3 days gone on its return route to Heth Station, and whatever had been in the active cache before the crash, including that manifest entry, including any records the ship might have carried, was locked in a partition nobody could read. She had no file, no confirmation, no colonial ID, no species registration, no intake record, no vulnerability flag. As far as every system that governed this camp and this moon and this sector of colonial space was concerned, she was not here. I had been in field medicine long enough to know what the Colonial Classification Bureau did with unregistered biological material discovered in transit zones. The language in the code was precise and deliberate. Any entity of indeterminate colonial status discovered in a transit facility without valid documentation was subject to classification review, collection, holding, and processing through the Bureau's Standard Determinations Protocol. The Determinations Protocol had 4 possible outcomes. I had seen paperwork from 3 of them at other postings. The 4th, reintegration to family unit of origin, required a family unit to be on record somewhere, which required the entity to be on record somewhere, which required documentation. Unregistered entities found in transit camps were collected by Bureau enforcement teams. The nearest Bureau office was at Heth Station. The camp's emergency protocols required Commander Vedrick to notify the Bureau within 6 hours of discovering any irregular intake that could not be logged through standard registry procedures. 6 hours. It was now approximately 300. That window closed at approximately 900, by which time Vedrick would have been awake for 2 hours and doing his morning rounds. I looked at the child sitting in the crate, drinking from a fluid line with careful small sips, watching me over the line with those amber eyes. I made a decision. I made it the way I make most decisions in the field, not with deliberation, but with the recognition that I already knew what I was going to do, and the deliberation was just the time I gave myself to confirm it. There are people who would tell you that this kind of decision deserves more gravity, more visible struggle. Those people have not spent 22 years in transit camps. When you have done this work long enough, you stop asking yourself what you should do. You ask yourself what you can live with. The answer to that question is usually already there, waiting. "What is your name?" I said. A pause, long enough that I thought she would not answer. Then, very quiet, in transit camp with an accent I could not place, something from the outer reaches, past the 3rd ring boundary, where the dialects layer differently. Vel. It might have been a name. It might have been a species designation. Velhara, shortened to the first syllable, the way children sometimes name what they are when they don't know if they're allowed to say who they are. I had seen that before, at other postings, in children who had been trained or had simply learned that the wrong name in the wrong mouth was a kind of address for danger. I did not press it. "All right," I said, "Vel." She looked at me. "I'm Senna," I said. "I'm the medic here. What I need you to know tonight is this. I'm going to take care of you, and nothing is going to happen to you while I'm the person in charge of this tent. Tomorrow is going to be complicated, but tonight you're my patient, and that's the only thing that's true." She looked at me for a long time after that. The kind of looking that weighs things. Then she looked down at the nutrition unit at the edge of the crate, and she picked it up and she ate. I carried her to the main tent at 3:10. She was lighter than she should have been for her size, the weight a child carries when she has been rationing water and not eating for several days. And she allowed being carried with the stillness of someone who understood that this was practical and not personal, that it did not mean anything yet. I set her on the 2nd examination cot, the one behind the partition that I kept for patients who needed quiet, and I did a full intake assessment by lamplight while she watched me work. I checked her hydration levels by capillary refill and skin turgor. I took her temperature with the wand minor elevation, consistent with mild dehydration and confinement stress. I checked her respiration, listened to her lungs, watched her chest move in that careful, controlled rhythm. I checked the copper markings at her temples and collarbone. They were clear and uninterrupted, no disruption at the line edges, which in this subspecies is a good indicator of metabolic stability, because those markings are vascular and they flag systemic strain before the rest of the body does. She had mild to moderate dehydration. She had bruising at her left hip and upper arm, both old, both at least 10 days healed to the color of fading. She had a small laceration behind her right ear, that had closed to a clean scar. I documented all of it in my paper ledger, in the small, precise handwriting I use when I know the record matters. I gave each observation its own line. Then I replaced the fluid line with a fresh pack and set it on a stand beside the cot, and I checked that she was warm enough, and I turned the lamp down to its lowest setting so the tent was dim but not dark. She watched all of this with the same careful attention. When I was done, she was still sitting up, watching me. "You can sleep," I said. "I'm going to be at that desk. You'll be able to see me the whole time." She looked at the desk, then back at me. Then she lay down very deliberately and pulled the thermal wrap up to her chin. She did not sleep immediately. I could see from the desk the slight tension in her shoulders that meant she was still awake and watchful. I understand that. I would have been too. I sat at my personal terminal, and I began to build her a record. I want to be honest about what I did, and about why, because I am not interested in making it sound larger or smaller than it was. I am not a lawbreaker by temperament any more than I am a suspicious one. I have worked within colonial systems my entire career, followed protocols, filed the right forms in the right order, trusted the framework when the framework was worth trusting. But I have also been in enough places where the framework fails, where the machine breaks and the record disappears and the person underneath the record becomes invisible to every protection the system was designed to offer, to understand that the framework is a tool, not a truth. Tools fail. When a tool fails, you use another tool or you make one. I should explain what I knew about the Colonial Classification Bureau and why the distinction between it and the auxiliary mattered. The auxiliary is a humanitarian body. Its mandate is care, medical treatment, protection of vulnerable populations during transit, facilitation of safe passage. The Bureau is a regulatory body. Its mandate is classification, verifying that every entity in colonial space has the documentation that places it within the framework of colonial law. Both are legitimate institutions. Both serve genuine purposes. But there is a gap between them, and that gap is a specific kind of child, the one who arrives without documentation, who does not exist in any system the Bureau can query, who is therefore, from the Bureau's operational perspective, not a vulnerable population requiring care, but an unclassified entity requiring classification. The processing that follows classification is not care. It has a different logic, different priorities, a different definition of what the entity's welfare means. I had seen what that processing looked like at one posting, 7 years ago. A family group, 3 individuals, 2 adults and 1 child, who had come through a station where the documentation requirements had not been met. The adults had lawyers, or had access to lawyers, or had someone who knew how to find lawyers. The child did not. I had filed a flag. The flag had been processed. The child had been held for 60 days while the Bureau ran its determinations. I had followed the case through the system as far as I was able to follow it, which was to the point where the Bureau's internal processing became opaque to outside query, and then I had lost track of it, and I had never found out what determination outcome the case had received. That was the only time I needed to see it. Some information, once you have it, you do not need again. Her name, for the purposes of the record I was building, was Velhari known. I constructed it carefully. Velhara was her species designation, which I embedded in the surname using the formatting the colonial system used for individuals of unaffiliated species registered through auxiliary intake. It would parse correctly in any automated scan, because the format was real, and the species code was real. Only the individual registration was new. Known was a blank surname assigned to individuals of unknown family origin who had come through auxiliary intake without documentation. I had assigned it at 2 other postings, to others, and it was a valid entry in the auxiliary's surname registry, which meant the system would not flag it as a fabrication. I gave her a date of intake consistent with the resupply ship's docking date 4 days ago, which was accurate. She had arrived in the camp 4 days ago, inside that crate. I gave her a vulnerability status of pediatric/unaccompanied/pending family trace, a real status code, a legitimate one, fully within my authority to assign as the station's medical officer, one that generated a specific protection flag in the system. Any attempt to transfer or relocate the patient during the pending trace required my written authorization. I wrote the full intake assessment in the record: her hydration status, her temperature, her respiration, her physical condition, her observed psychological state, alert, guarded, cooperative with assessment, the old bruising, the healed laceration. I wrote it in the same clinical language I used for every other intake record in 22 years, not because clinical language obscures things. It doesn't, from someone who knows how to read it, but because clinical language is the language the system speaks, and the system needed to hear this record in its own voice. I flagged her record incomplete registry offline pending confirmation when system restores, which was accurate. The registry was offline. The confirmation would be pending. Everything I had written was, technically, literally true. Then I went back to the relay cabinet, and I noted the specific error code from the diagnostic strip. Then I went to the protocol binder on the shelf above the cabinet. The physical binder, the one that had been hanging there since the camp's first operational month, because the auxiliary required field stations to maintain physical copies of relevant protocols, because physical copies do not crash, and I found the section on registry failure procedures. Protocol Registry Failure, Section 4, Paragraph 2. In the event of total registry cache corruption, the station's medical officer is authorized to maintain temporary patient records via any available documentation method, including physical ledger, until such time as the registry is restored. Records maintained under this provision are considered legally equivalent to digital registry entries for the duration of the failure window, and are subject to standard reconciliation procedures upon restoration. I had read that paragraph at 2 other postings. I had used it at both as reassurance that my paper ledger entries were legally valid during downtime. I had read it then as a provision protecting existing records during system failures. I read it now with a different question. The paragraph said, records maintained in the physical ledger are legally equivalent to digital registry entries. It did not specify that those records had to have existed in the digital registry first. It did not distinguish between records that had been in the crashed cache and records that had not been. It said, physical ledger equals digital registry during the failure window subject to reconciliation. I read the paragraph 3 more times. I read the paragraph above it and the paragraph below it. The one above covered the procedure for notifying the Colonial Data Authority of a failure event, the registry failure notice, which I had already decided to file. The one below covered the procedure for completing reconciliation upon restoration. Neither of them said anything that changed the question. The provision was written broadly. I knew why it was written broadly. Because field conditions are unpredictable, because the specific situations a medical officer might face during a registry failure are impossible to fully enumerate in advance, and because the lawyers who drafted colonial humanitarian protocols understood that narrow language kills people in the gaps. A medical officer in the field during a registry failure, with 700 patients and no uplink and an evacuation convoy incoming, needs the authority to make decisions. The protocol gave her that authority. It gave me that authority. I thought about the 43 genuine new arrivals whose records were in my ledger and nowhere else, whose intake records had gone into the active cache in the 61 hours before the crash and had not yet been confirmed to the live grid. They were in exactly the same documentary state she would be in, records that existed in my physical ledger, that could be cross-referenced against the camp's arrival logs, that had not yet made it into any system the Bureau could query. The registry failure had not created their situation. It had created the condition under which their situation was visible, a window of legitimate, legally authorized record-keeping outside the digital system, during which the physical ledger was the only record that existed. The same window held her record. The reconciliation sweep would flag all 44 as pending. The CDA would process the reconciliation in 90 to 120 days. By that point, the convoy would be gone, and she would be at Seville Station, and the family trace would be running, and 44 reconciliation flags in a remote postings records would be exactly what the 3 administrators in the CDA's Outer Reach office expected to find when they opened the file. A routine registry failure, a routine failure provision period, a routine reconciliation queue. Reconciliation, 90 to 120 days. The evacuation convoy was in 51 hours. I made a decision about the direction the equivalents ran. At 4:10, I filed a registry failure notice with Commander Vedrick's office. The paper form dropped in his physical inbox because his terminal was connected to the same offline server and also showed 88 in its corner. The notice documented the failure, its timestamp, the error code, the affected data, and the steps I had taken as medical officer to maintain record continuity under Protocol Registry Failure, Section 4, Paragraph 2. I listed the number of active patients in the facility. I listed the range of case numbers currently documented in the physical ledger under the failure provision. Her case number was in that range. I went back to the main tent. She was asleep. She was curled on her side with the thermal wrap pulled up to her chin and one hand tucked under her cheek, and she looked in sleep like what she was, a child. A small child who had been alone in a dark box for 4 days and who was now in a lit tent with a medic at the desk and filtered air and a fluid line doing its quiet work. And whatever her body had been holding together through will and discipline, sleep had let go of it, and she was just sleeping. I sat at my desk and watched the tent's air filtration unit cycle and listened to the camp breathe outside in the dark and thought about the next 4 hours. At 600, I made my rounds, 740 patients in various states of need. I did them the way I always did, one cot at a time, paper ledger in hand, marking each entry in the same handwriting. When I reached her cot behind the partition, I marked her the same way I marked every other patient. Intake, stable, vitals within expected parameters, hydration, continuing, care status, active. I gave her the nutrition unit when she woke at 6:30, and she ate it in the same careful way she did everything, measured, efficient, not greedy, which is the eating of someone who has learned not to trust that more is coming. She watched me while she ate. I did not make her talk. At 7:15, Commander Vedrick came in for his morning walkthrough. He was a large man, Vedrick. Former colonial fleet, retired at 50 to humanitarian work because he had a conscience he developed late and didn't know what else to do with. He walked the tent the way fleet officers walk everything, looking for what doesn't fit. He was not warm, but he was fair, and in a transit camp at the end of a crisis posting, fairness matters more than warmth. He stopped at the partition. He looked at it. He looked at me. "Who's behind here?" he said. "Pediatric intake," I said. "Unaccompanied minor came in during the resupply window. Pediatric/unaccompanied/pending family trace status. I've got her on a fluid line for dehydration." He looked at my face, then at the partition. "Registry." "Registry's down," I said. "Case is documented in my physical ledger under the registry failure provision. I filed the registry failure notice at 4:10. It'll be in your inbox." He looked at his own terminal across the tent. The 88 was still cycling in the corner. He looked back at me. "She's stable," he said. "Yes, mild to moderate dehydration resolving. Some old soft tissue bruising, nothing acute. She's eating." He nodded once, slowly. I have seen that nod before, on other station commanders at other postings. It is the nod of a man who is deciding exactly how much he is willing to not know, and where the line is between institutional obligation and human judgment, and whether the two are reconcilable in the next 30 seconds. "Keep me updated," he said. "Yes, sir," I said. He finished his walkthrough and left. I let out a breath I had not been aware of holding. Then I sat back down and opened the medication log. Between Vedrick's departure at 7:30 and the Bureau's arrival at 12:47, I had 5 hours. I used them the way I use all the time I have, working. There was a camp of 740 people to manage, medications to dispense, 3 patients whose conditions had changed overnight and who needed revised care plans, 2 intake assessments to complete, and the ongoing documentation work that a registry failure creates. Every entry requiring more careful notation than usual, every decision requiring the paper record that might later be asked to stand on its own. I also spent time with her. Not long stretches. She did not need or want long stretches of attention, which was itself information about the kind of care she had received before the crate. People who have had consistent, reliable care can tolerate a caregiver's absence without distress, because they have learned that the caregiver returns. She was not distressed by my absences. She tracked my movements across the tent from behind the partition. I could see her watching through the gap in the curtain, but she did not call for me, and she did not become agitated when I was occupied with other patients. She simply watched and waited, and when I came back to her, she was where she had been. At 900, I brought her a second nutrition unit. She was sitting up, looking at the fluid line running from the stand to her wrist, examining the mechanism of the clamp, not tampering with it, studying it. "That controls the drip rate," I said. She looked at me, then back at the clamp. "If you turn it that way, it slows down," I said. "The other way speeds it up." She looked at me again. Something shifted in her expression, not quite trust, but the precursor to it, the moment before a door opens. "You can touch it," I said. "You won't break anything." She put one finger on the clamp wheel and turned it slowly, the way I had indicated. Watched the drip slow, turned it back, watched the drip resume. "Medics know these things," she said. It was a statement, not a question. "Yes," I said. "That's what medics know." She thought about that, then she said, "I want to know these things." I sat down at the edge of the cot. "Then you'll have to go to school for it," I said. "There's a school at Seville Station. There are several. The people you're going to meet there will help you figure out which ones are right." She looked at the drip. "Can you learn it from watching?" "Some of it," I said. "The rest you learn from doing, with someone who can correct you when you do it wrong." She nodded, the serious nod of a child who is filing information for later use. I went back to my desk. I had known they were coming since 12:20, when Vedrick found me in the supply annex. I was cataloging a damaged inventory item, which was also accurate, and told me, quietly, that a classification bureau team was en route from Heth Station. Bureau protocol, he said, required an audit of any humanitarian facility experiencing a registry failure of more than 12 hours during an active population cycle. They would arrive within the hour. They would want to verify records and cross-reference physical documentation against the last available cache snapshot. He told me this looking at a point slightly to the left of my face. He said it in the tone of a man delivering information he is choosing not to interpret. "Understood," I said. "I'll have my documentation ready." There were 4 of them. Senior Auditor Kasek, a compact woman with the Bureau's gray and the flat attention of someone who had been doing this long enough to have stopped being surprised by anything. 2 field assessors, interchangeable in the practical sense, and a records analyst with a portable scanning unit in a rigid case. They entered at 12:47, and Auditor Kasek introduced herself and outlined the nature of the audit, and asked for the station's medical officer. "That's me," I said. Senna Vale, Senior Field Medic, Colonial Humanitarian Auxiliary, 22 years active service. I offered my credentials. I filed the registry failure notice at 4:10. I assume that triggered your visit. Among other things, she said. She handed my credentials to the analyst without looking at them, which told me how she ran her process. She stayed on the conversation. The analyst handled the verification. We'll need to review your physical documentation and cross-reference against our cached snapshot of the station's last good registry state. Of course, my ledger is here. She took it. She sat at my desk, the one that still showed 88 on the camp terminal, and the analyst stood beside her with the portable unit, and they began working through the records systematically. I stood nearby, close enough to answer questions without crowding the process, because the worst thing you can do during a bureaucratic audit is to look like you are trying to manage one. Most of the records checked out cleanly. The records that had existed in the grid's confirmed state before the crash were there in both the snapshot and the ledger, matching on every detail. When a record appeared in the ledger but not in the snapshot, the analyst flagged it and read out the case number, and I explained. New arrival came in during the failure window. Record was in the active cache but not yet confirmed to the live grid. The analyst cross-referenced each one against the camp's docking and arrival logs, which were on a separate physical system and were not affected by the registry failure, and confirmed arrival dates. Record by record, the picture assembled correctly. 43 new intakes during the failure window, all with legitimate arrival dates, all with matching entries in the ledger and the arrival logs. Her record was the 38th they reached. This one isn't in the snapshot, the analyst said. He was frowning at his screen in the specific way of a man who does not like discrepancies and has been finding too many of them for comfort. She came in during the resupply window, I said. 4 days ago. Her intake record would have been in the active cache partition, not in the confirmed grid state. The cache crashed before her record was confirmed up. The snapshot is 61 hours old, he said. You're saying she was logged 4 days ago and still hadn't been confirmed to the grid. Camp intake records go into the active cache first, I said. Confirmation to the live grid runs on the 12-hour sync cycle. If she came in between sync windows, she'd sit in the cache until the next cycle ran. If the next cycle ran and confirmed her, she'd be in the snapshot. If the confirmation cycle had a delay or she was processed outside the sync window, she'd still be in the active cache, which crashed. This was a true and accurate description of how colonial registry synchronization worked. I knew it was accurate because I had read the technical documentation for the system at my first posting, 15 years ago, when a partial failure had made me want to understand exactly how records moved through the pipeline. The analyst checked the resupply ship's docking log. He compared it to the intake date in the ledger. He frowned more deeply, which I had come to read as confirmation. Vulnerability status, he said. Pediatric/unaccompanied/pending family trace. Correct. That requires a family trace filing with the Colonial Data Authority. Yes, I said. The filing would have been submitted through the registry. The registry is down. When the registry restores, the filing will be submitted automatically as part of the pending actions queue, along with all other pending actions that accumulated during the failure window. Until the trace runs, who has authority over the child's placement? I do, I said. As the responsible medical officer under pediatric/unaccompanied status, any transfer or relocation requires my written authorization while the trace is pending. A pause. The analyst looked at Auditor Kasek. She looked at him. Something passed between them that was not quite a question and not quite an answer. Is she present in the facility? Kasek said. She's behind the partition, I said. She's been through a difficult transit. I'd ask that any assessment be brief and conducted calmly. Kasek gestured to one of the assessors. The assessor went around the partition. I followed. She was awake. I thought she had been awake since the moment the bureau's team had entered the tent, because she was that kind of child, but she was lying still with the wrap pulled up and her face composed into the neutral, careful expression that was her default. The assessor crouched at the edge of the cot. "Can you tell me your name?" She looked at him, then she looked at me. "Velhari," I said from behind him. "She's been speaking minimally since intake. That's consistent with her status and the transit circumstances." The assessor made a note on his handheld unit. He checked the fluid line, the vital monitor I had attached to her wrist, the overall condition of the cot and the care setup. Professional, efficient. He was looking for signs of inadequate care. I knew that was part of the audit function, confirming that pediatric intakes in the failure window had received appropriate medical attention. The setup was immaculate. It was immaculate because I had made sure it was immaculate, because I have been doing this for 22 years, and I know what adequate care looks like, and I know what a professional audit expects to find, and I had made sure that every visible element of her care met or exceeded that standard. "Family trace status," the assessor said. "When will the filing go in?" "When the registry restores," I said. "At that point, if no family unit is located within the trace window, her case transfers to the auxiliary's pediatric protection protocol. She'll be placed with a receiving facility on the evacuation convoy, specifically the auxiliary's pediatric protection unit at Seville Station, which has full family trace infrastructure and the resources to continue the search." The assessor looked at me, then at her, then at his unit. "Seville Station is on the convoy roster," Kasich said. From behind me, she had come around the partition. She was looking at the child, not at me. "Yes," I said. "It's the appropriate receiving facility for unaccompanied pediatric intakes of this status." Kasich looked at her for a moment, the amber eyes looking back with that careful stillness, and then she looked at me, and in that look was something I could not entirely read, which was unusual because I am good at reading people. It was not hostility. It was not suspicion, exactly. It was the look of a person who has seen a great many things and is deciding how many of them she is seeing right now. She said, "You're the medical officer." "Yes," I said. "And the child is in your care medically?" "Yes." "And the family trace will run when the registry restores?" "Yes." A pause long enough to be a decision. Then she said, "Carry on," and went back around the partition. They audited the rest of the tent. They spent 40 minutes in the supply annex. I walked them through the full inventory myself, including the manifest reconciliation, the defective equipment log, the flagged crate. The crate that had held her was logged as a defective shipping unit with a compromised saline seal, pending disposal under the camp's contaminated inventory protocol. The manifest tags still read what it had always read. The crate was empty. The air canister was in the medical waste log as damaged equipment, which was accurate. Auditor Kasich filed her preliminary report at 16:18. I read it that evening. It verified my compliance with the registry failure protocol, documented the 44 records pending reconciliation, and flagged the cable's reach station for standard reconciliation review upon restoration. Standard reconciliation review. 90 to 120 days. I read the report twice. I was looking for the shape of what she had seen and what she had decided not to see, because I understood that there was a difference and that the difference was significant. A good auditor in a field posting is not the same as a good auditor in a controlled environment. A good auditor in a field posting learns to distinguish between the things that need to be corrected and the things that are simply the field doing what the field does, finding ways through, finding ways around, finding the gap between what the protocol says and what the situation requires. Kasich had been in the bureau's gray long enough to know that distinction. She had seen something in that tent, and she had decided what category it belonged in. and what I was holding in my hands was her decision, documented in official language that said nothing about decisions at all. I do not know, to this day, exactly what she understood. I have a strong suspicion which I will keep to myself. What I know is what the report says. And what the report says is that 44 records were pending reconciliation, that the station's medical officer was in compliance with all applicable protocols, and that no irregularities requiring further action had been identified. No irregularities requiring further action. I folded the report and put it in my administrative file in the section labeled Audit Documentation Registry Failure Event, and I sat for a moment in the quiet of the tent. Outside, the camp was settling into the evening cycle. 740 people going about the small business of surviving another day in a transit situation, the sounds that make. Low voices, the movement of cots, the hiss of the filtration units, children calling to each other in the way children call, short and sharp and oblivious to circumstance. She was behind the partition, eating the nutrition unit I had left her, reading. I had found a reader in the pediatric supply kit with a small library of simple texts loaded on it, and she had looked at it the way she looked at the drip clamp, with the focused attention of someone who intends to understand something completely before they move on. I thought about the 3 hours between 2:30, when I had found her, and 5:30, when I had finished the registry failure notice and the record and the ledger, and sat back in my chair for the first time. The 88 on the camp terminal had still been cycling when I looked up. The impossible time. The time the system generates when it cannot find a valid reference, when all its clocks have failed and the number it shows is not a number at all but an admission. I do not know what time it is. I cannot tell you. The frame of reference is gone. That is the moment this had all lived in. The moment between the machine failing and the machine being fixed, when the only record that existed was the one I chose to keep. She was in that moment too. She had arrived in the wrong time, the broken time, the time the system could not categorize. And in that time she had been visible only to whoever was awake and looking. I had been awake, I had been looking. That is not heroism, that is a shift rotation. 22 years of shift rotations, 9 hours ahead of the maintenance schedule because the tower work at Heth Station had gone faster than projected. I was awake. I sat at my terminal and watched the system restore and synchronize and run its reconciliation sweep. And I watched the sweep flag 44 records as pending grid confirmation, her record among them. And I submitted the family trace filing for Velhari known, and I watched the system accept it and log it and assign it a trace reference number. Then I sat in the quiet for a while. She was asleep behind the partition. I could see the shape of her from the desk, the thermal wrap pulled up, the slow, even breathing of a child who had, for the first time in however long, allowed herself to sleep without one part of her brain on watch. I went to the protocol binder again. I turned to Section 12 of the Auxiliary's Operational Guidelines, the Pediatric Protection Protocol. I read the relevant paragraphs. Then I sat back down and I wrote 3 paragraphs in a private message to the head of the receiving unit at Seville Station, a woman named Ora Veth, whom I had worked with 6 years ago on a different posting, who was quiet and competent, and who understood what the words between the words meant. I did not tell Ora what I had done. I did not need to. I told her what I knew, that the child's name was Vel, that she was Velhara subspecies with copper vascular markings, that she had arrived under difficult circumstances, and had responded well to consistent, patient care, that she spoke transit cant with an outer-ring accent, that she was more capable than she appeared and more frightened than she showed, and that she needed someone who would not rush her. Ora replied within the hour, 2 words understood, ready. I folded that message and kept it with my personal records. The convoy arrived on schedule. I managed her transfer personally. I completed the transport documentation, listed her receiving unit as the Auxiliary's Pediatric Protection Facility at Seville Station, and signed the transfer authorization myself. I packed her care kit, a full supply of the nutrition units she had been eating, a replacement fluid pack in case the journey was long, the wrist vitals monitor, and a small pen light I kept as a spare, because children who have spent time in enclosed dark spaces sometimes need a light they can hold. I put her on the convoy at 6:14. She was wearing a clean set of clothes from the pediatric supply kit, and she had the pen light in her hand, and she had put the loop of it around her wrist so it would not be dropped. The night before, I had told her plainly in transit camp what would happen, where the convoy was going, what Seville Station was, who Oraveth was and what she did, that the family trace had been filed and that people were going to look. I told her I did not know what the trace would find because I did not, and I did not tell children things I did not know as if I knew them. She had listened to all of it with the same careful attention she gave everything. Then she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You made me a file." "Yes," I said. "Before?" "Yes," I said, "before the registry came back." She looked at the floor of the tent, thinking. Then she said, "Before you knew my name." I sat with that for a moment, then I said, "I knew what you needed." That was enough to start with. She considered that the way she considered everything, seriously, without hurry, as if the consideration itself was important. Then she said very quietly, "Vel." "I know," I said. "My name," she said, "it's Vel." Not the species designation, a name, her name. I reached for my paper ledger, the one on the desk in front of me, the one with her intake record and her assessment and her medication log and 22 years of other records before hers. I turned to her page. I had written Velhari known in careful clinical handwriting in the name field. Beside it I wrote, in the small notation script I use for addenda, preferred name, Vel. Then I closed the ledger. She watched me do it. "Senna," she said. The word careful, deliberate, like she was setting it somewhere she would be able to find it later. "Yes," I said. She nodded once, as if confirming something to herself. In the morning she boarded the convoy without looking back. I stood at the ramp and I watched her go small in the clean clothes, the penlight looped at her wrist, the careful measured step of someone who has decided that going is the right thing and is now simply doing it. Children who have survived what she had survived do not look back on the way toward safety. Looking back is a habit of people who are still deciding whether to go. She had decided. The convoy left at 700. I stayed at Cavel's Reach for the 3 weeks it took to close the camp. I ran the deregistration process, completed the reconciliation paperwork when the CDA's review came through 93 days after the filing, and signed the station's closure documentation the day Commander Vedrick and the last of the staff shipped out. I was the last person to leave, which I always am. Someone has to turn out the light. I received the notification from Seville Station 14 days after the convoy arrived. The family trace for Velhari known had returned results. I will not say what those results were, because that is her story and not mine. What I will say is that she was placed in a good situation, and that Oraveth sent me a private note afterward, brief and professional, that included the sentence, "She asked about you." I read that sentence more times than was strictly necessary, and then I filed it with my personal records and got on with the next posting. Field medicine does not hold still for sentiment, neither do I, as a rule. I returned to active posting 2 months after Cavel's Reach closed. New assignment, different moon, different camp, different crisis in a different language with different faces and the same essential problem. People needing more than the system had built itself to give them. That is always the problem. It is also always the work. I thought about her sometimes. The way you think about the cases that matter quietly, at odd hours, with a specific quality of attention that is not grief, and is not hope exactly, but is something that sits between the two. A kind of ongoing awareness that a thing was real, and is now somewhere you cannot see. I had given her my professional care and the best documentation I knew how to build, and an introduction to people I trusted. And I had let her go, because letting go is what you do when you have done everything you can, and the next chapter belongs to someone else. I did not expect to hear from her. I heard from her 12 years later. The message came to my professional terminal on a morning in early spring at whatever posting I was at. I have done enough postings that the specific one has blurred, though I remember the quality of the light through the window and the smell of the air filtration unit cycling. It was a short message. No name in the sender field. No case number. No registry reference of any kind. The first line said, "I know what you did. I have always known." The second line said, "I became a medic." And then, after a space, the way you put space before something that needs room. "Thank you, Senna." I sat with that for a long time, the morning light moving through the window, the filtration unit cycling. Then I printed the message. I still keep a small portable printer in my kit for exactly this reason, the reason being that some things should exist on paper, and I wrote in the margin in the small precise notation script, "Vel, found, well, her own, 12 years. I folded it and put it in the back of my paper ledger, where I keep the things that do not fit any formal category. Then I closed the ledger, and I went to make my rounds. That is what 22 years teaches you. Not everything has a clean record. Not everything arrives with a name the system can find, and a history that the grid has confirmed, and a case number that traces back to a source. Some things arrive in the dark, in a crate that is supposed to hold something else, breathing air from a cracked canister, waiting to see whether the person who opens the lid is the kind of person who reaches for their protocol binder, or the kind who reaches for a fluid pack. The record is not the person. The system is not the truth. The system is the machine someone built to hold the truth, to hold it long enough to pass it along until the machine fails. When the machine fails, the record still has to be kept. Someone has to decide to keep it. I was awake, I kept it. I will keep being awake. That is all it ever was. That is everything it was.